Welcome back to the second part of this seminar. I have the pleasure of leaving the floor to Alexander Zomek, the author of the book we have been talking about in the first part. Before, I would like to introduce him. He's professor of legal philosophy at the Institute of Legal Philosophy at the University of Vienna School of Law. Prior to this position, he was for 12 years, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of Iowa. So there was a period in which Alexander Zomek was traveling back and forth from the United States to Europe, and he was kind of external, internal observer of European matters. When I was reading this book, I was wondering also if there was underlying the book an autobiographical note, whether the book is also the result of his cosmopolitan experience in the United States, but perhaps this is something will come up in his answers to our comments and questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Actually, it is. I can reply to this question right away. Much of the last part of the book, in which I try to examine under which conditions a foreigner can feel comfortable and, in a certain way, self-determining when living in a foreign country. Exploring these conditions is something that I thought was useful when I lived in the United States under conditions of disenfranchisement, because to this day I'm not and will never be an American citizen. Yeah. So I lived as a foreigner and wondering, how does the political process that exists in the United States represent me, even though I'm a foreigner? And this is how I rediscovered Edmund Burke and developed these ideas on virtual representation. But before I return to this, let me thank the commentators, and it's a genuine gratitude that I feel, because exposure to comments is something that appeals to two layers in your personality. The first layer is your ego, and your immediate reaction is, well, now I have to defend myself and get things straight. But it's not a completely honest response if you do that, because there's another layer of your personality that is engaged when you get these criticisms. It's the part of your personality that works on a subconscious level in you. You begin to discover all of a sudden that there were intentions when you were writing these books that you were not aware of, yeah? That there were certain themes that were on your mind and you didn't perceive it clearly. So it is indeed something like a therapeutical exercise that I get here, yeah? So here are my three therapists, yeah? That help me to understand better what I was actually trying to accomplish with this book. And I'm very grateful for this. So if Marco said that he sounded more critical, or will sound more critical than he actually is of my book, so I may well be more defensive now in my comments than I am of my book, because I perceive the weaknesses of my book, I think, quite clearly, and even more clearly now that I've had your comments. Before I try to respond to the points that you make, let me talk to the audience really quickly and address the audience and explain to the audience what triggered the whole project. Why do you sit down and write this type of book? And it emerged from my dissatisfaction with two features of the European constitutional discourse. You may remember it. You were still alive, but you didn't follow the events. Yeah? But you may remember it in the early 2000s. We had this project in Europe to arrive and to establish a European constitution. So there was a lot of talk about constitutionalism and the future European constitution among European Union law scholars and public law scholars in general in Europe. But I thought that the whole discourse was wanting, and there were two elements in particular that were missing. First of all, the discourse was relatively ahistorical. And it was ahistorical, and it suffered in particular at the hands of my German colleagues. My German colleagues took the German experiment, or the German experience with the constitution, with the value order that is established in Germany, as the totality of constitutionalism. as though nothing has been before and nothing afterwards. Yeah? And I thought, no, we have to bring constitutionalism again in historical perspective. And bringing historical constitutionalism into historical perspective meant to me to explore a certain way of thinking about the political world. Yeah? So constitutionalism is for me a name for a mode of thinking about the political world, of organizing our political dealings that puts actually law at the center. Modern constitutionalism puts law at the center. The Constitution all of a sudden is understood to be law, and this is the essence of the Constitution, that the Constitution is law. So there's this strong emphasis on the normative component of law in constitutionalism. So this is something that I wanted to put in historical perspective, which is why I went back historically to constitutionalism 1.0 before we get to 2.0. The second thing that I found really disturbing and wanting and really deficient about the discourse is that nobody talked about collective self-determination. Well, talk to Germans today, when they talk about the Constitution, they talk about fundamental rights, the role of the Constitutional Court, perhaps the allocation of powers, but that the Constitution is something that we design in order to facilitate collective self-determination is something that has more or less disappeared from the horizon of modern constitutionalists. And I wanted to reclaim the relevance of collective self-determination, and I went so far as to develop alternative conceptions to political self-determination. In the book you may find this relatively helpless efforts, yeah? Maybe I don't know how successful I was to try to conceive of cosmopolitan forms of collective self-determination, a dependent form and an independent or pure form, as I called it. So this was the attempt to reclaim the relevance of collective self-determination to constitutionalism. Now the book also has a historical sensibility. And the usual historical sensibility that you get in discourses on constitutionalism today, in particular those who are in favor of global constitutionalism, they actually display this sensibility, it has sensibility that I would call, using the name of a famous social theorist of the 19th century, a Tocquevillian sensibility. Actually referring to Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote this wonderful book, this masterful book on democracy in America. But the basic historical orientation of Tocqueville's book is that what we see in the United States, what is going on in the United States, is a force that we cannot stop. It is a force that will prevail in the future. We may like it or not, and I suspect that Tocqueville didn't like it, yeah? But it is something that is unstoppable, and we better understand it, yeah, before we fall victim to it, and are completely defenseless against it. And the idea that this is a revolutionary and revolving and reappearing unstoppable force, constitutionalism, is something that you get in the global constitutionalism discourse. This is more or less taken for granted. No, you may have guessed it already. My perspective is Hegelian. My perspective on constitutionalism is Hegelian in the sense that Hegel explains it in the introduction to his legal philosophy. Once a development in human history has run its course and has exercised its full force, and once the powers that actually acted upon one another in a historical process to bring certain institutions and certain ideas to fruition, we are finally in a position to understand it. And we begin to understand it actually when the idea is already losing its force, yeah? When it becomes in a sense weaker. Then we have sufficient distance to reconstruct how it actually works intellectually. And this was the idea. This is the idea animating the book. And yes, I am committed to ancient political philosophy on several levels. I look at modern constitutionalism as something that begins with the idea that the Constitution is a norm, yeah, goes through several transformations, and has to admit at the end of the day, well, maybe the Constitution is not a norm after all, because the Constitution is actually composed of different forces that try to attain some balance. This is an exercise in ancient political philosophy because, Marco, you've stated it, because it is romantic in the sense that it believes that it is part of human nature and of realizing your human nature that you are politically self-determining and engage in political action in combination with others. And yes, it is ancient political philosophy, because I think it's not just normative political theory that tries to reconstruct different concepts and conceptions of authority. It takes, maybe less though than my book Individualism, but it takes social psychology seriously. Yeah? It takes seriously that certain constitutions exist for certain types of persons, and that there are certain visions of human life built into constitutional systems. And we have to take this into account. But maybe this is not strongly present in this book as it is in other works of mine. I work, and I thereby conclude my introductory remarks, and then I reply to your statement. I work, of course, with simplifications. What I develop in these books, when I sketch these 3 stages of the development of the constitutional project, is what Max Weber would have called ideal types. And ideal types are always simplifications. Yeah, they make realities more simply. They render reality in a more simple way. They leave many detailed aspects out, and in a sense they are false. They are overstatements. I think that's the right way of putting it. They are overstatements. They overstate certain features of institutions and institutional realities that you encounter and ways of thinking that you encounter, and they overstate them in order to make them more visible. So in a sense, there's always the danger, the risk of creating caricatures actually of actual realities when you do that, and I'm aware of this risk. So these are simplifications that I work with, and I made my task simple by just looking at paradigmatic examples, and it's questionable, of course, to use. It is particularly questionable to use German constitutional law, because I can imagine that the Italian constitutional experience, or maybe the French constitutional experience, or the constitutional experience of Spain, for that matter, would have given me quite similar material to work with. It is just the case, actually, this is where it's reflected that I'm a small country national. It's just the case that if you are working from within the German language tradition, Germany has set this incredible precedent for everyone else of constitutional thinking that is so different from the original way of thinking in constitutional law that I couldn't but resist transforming Germany into some form of ideal type, and I ask for apologies, and apologize to Italians in particular, that I didn't look around in other constitutional traditions and see what I would have found there. Okay, this is the general introduction. Now let me try to reply to some of the points that you've made. I may miss some of the points, but all of them I think were important, and all of them made me think. First, Marco, the main protagonist of the book is absent, the state. Why is there no theory of the state? Well, if I explore my own, the basis of my own work, I have 2 replies to it. The first is that there is a Marxist reluctance to put the state into a position where it is actually the agent of emancipation. And this goes back to the fact that human emancipation is something that is sketched in the early work of Marx and Engels, not with reference to the state, but rather with the idea, with reference that, well, in this case, the proletariat, or a group of people, will rise above their mutual dependence and take action and act upon it, regardless of the fact that there is already a state that tries to sustain it. So there was a power that actually Marx never really sufficiently accounted for, and maybe he should have actually called it the state. Actually, it was Lukács, I think, in History of Class and Class Consciousness, who then called the proletariat as the state in the Marxist sense. This is the emancipatory form of the proletariat, and no, actually, the vanguard party is in the role of the state. But let's leave this aside. So this is the reluctance to celebrate the state, because otherwise, also under the conditions on which I've written the book, I would have been in the position and could have been easily dismissed, again, in particular by my German colleagues, as someone who belongs to the old-fashioned groups of traditional German Staatsrechtslehrer, yeah, who bemoan the demise of the state. So this is something that I wanted to avoid, and this is why the state plays a secret role, maybe in the book, but not this explicit role that it maybe should have played. Another explanation may well be, and this is something that I learned recently in a discussion in Florence, that there is this little Kelsenian residing in my chest, yeah, that I have it. And if you are Kelsenian, if Kelsen is the author from which you come from, it's irrelevant whether you talk about law or the state, because it's all the same, yeah? So that's it. Let me get to your final remarks. Let me jump to your final remarks, because all three of you have made this point, and that's a very important point, and that's a point that really hurts, yeah? You, all of three, repeated Schelling's critique of Hegel, in a sense. And Schelling's critique of Hegel was, Hegel, in your work, you describe transformations of ways of thinking, and actually present them as though they were historical transformations. But you never get to the level of reality, and this is a point that you have made. Where are the real agents behind all of this? Yeah? Where are the real agents that have driven the change? Now, my easy reply would be, the easy and, let's say, the empiricist's reply would be, oh, there were many agents. There's not just one agent that explains the transformation. Political circumstances, political actors that try to re-establish democracy in Germany after the Second World War, a group of lawyers that was particularly committed to Roman Catholic ideas and therefore embraced the idea of human dignity, a court that actually tapped the opportunity to put itself at the center of the political system. In Germany, in particular, a very traditional and deeply ingrained skepticism towards democracy. I think this is something the Germans never talk enough about, yeah, that made all of this possible. So this would be the many agents explanation that I could offer to you. But I'm not convinced that it's really sufficient. The only way out that I find with regard to your criticisms, where are the real agents and transformations of this change, is that my project was, in a sense, a perfectly Hegelian project. I tried to study the ideas of modern constitutionalism with the premise that they are given with the French Revolution and with the American Revolution. Everything is there. We just have to draw out the implications through some learning processes that we have to go through. But my interest has always been an intellectual one. How do certain processes explain, or how do certain processes trigger a further differentiation, a further elaboration, and certain transformations of how we think about constitutions? Why do we get from one point to the other in light of certain experiences? But the transformation is something that affects our way of thinking about constitutional law, and not actual historical practice. So in this sense, I'm guilty of Hegelianism. That's right, I'm guilty of Hegelianism. But this was part of the project of studying how we get from one point in constitutionalism to the next. And there are certain critical moments, and they are intellectual moments than actual historical transformations. So I'm guilty of that. Necessity. This is a point, Marco, that you brought up. I look at constitutionalism as a project of emancipation. That's something that modern constitutionalists have forgotten too. And there are two major steps of emancipation. One is feudal subordination. And I think this is our traditional political vocabulary. And I think Republicans, neo-Republicans, Republicans of the kind that we encounter in the work of Philip Pettit would agree with it. Emancipation from feudal hierarchy means that you throw off the last shackles of servitude and slavery thereby. So constitutionalism that embraces the values of equality, freedom, and solidarity is an attempt to throw off these shackles, and it's an act of emancipation. The second stage of emancipation is, of course, the emancipation as envisaged by Karl Marx in his early work. The emancipation from the necessities that we create for ourselves. Man-made necessities, of course, yeah? You're completely right about it. Socially constructed necessities. With the attempt to transform mere interdependence that we cannot escape into something that we can endorse because we can endorse it as social freedom. Let me try to explain social freedom for a moment so that the audience can understand it too, what the idea of social freedom is. It's a Hegelian idea, and again, as it is the case in most Hegelian ideas, it's better explained by the commentators of Hegel's philosophy than it is by Hegel himself. Hegel and Wittgenstein have this in common, namely that the secondary literature is always better than the original. Yeah? So, the idea is that you are socially free once you have understood that you were incapable of achieving what you want in your life unless you are supported by others. So the actions of others are part of the actions that you carry out if you enjoy the life of a free person. There is an element that actually goes beyond mere freedom of choice or freedom of action, namely the element of self-realization that goes into the idea of social freedom. And I can explain it in this context, what social freedom means. There's something mutual about realizing our ends that is going on in this room, or at any rate, this is what I would like to believe as a university professor. We like to delude ourselves into believing this. The fact that you come here and listen to our discussion allows me to reconsider my work and to realize my end to produce scholarship and meaningful scholarship in the future. And you make it possible because I need exactly this kind of social context where this is going on. At the same time, and this is why I may delude myself, the fact that I'm speaking here, or the fact I don't want to talk about myself, that my colleagues have spoken here, provides you with an incentive to explore new ideas, to grow intellectually, yeah? Or not to read the book, yeah? So, but there is a mutuality in self-realization built into it. If social freedom is something that is realized in society, you look at these type of institutions. Now, caution. Here's the caution. Yeah, there's a label, a sticker. I attach a pink or a yellow sticker to it. Caution. This idea can easily be turned into something very conservative because Hegelians, right-wing Hegelians, and my dear friend Hauke Brunkhorst accuses me of right-wing Hegelianism. This is a pretty severe charge. Yeah, right-wing Hegelians will say, well, the institutions are already in place. The family is the place where this kind of self-realization goes on between and among members in the family. The university is the place where this kind of self-realization is. So we have the institutions, and all that we need to do legally is to protect these institutions. And there's a German constitutional theory, Heberle's theory of fundamental rights, that has actually made this claim. Yeah? And we have to be careful that we don't transform it into an idea that justifies existing institutions. We have to make sure that we account of the experience that people actually make in these institutions and that we invite criticism. So transform social interaction that we first experience as constraining because we are forced into certain pursuits as much as we can into social spheres of social freedom. And there may not be much that we can do, and there may be the only thing that we may be able to do is to try to decommodify our lives as much as possible and to create these outlets where we are truly socially free. So accept a certain level of necessity, as Marx did towards the end of his life. Accept a certain level of necessity, but make us independent from it. You, all of you, go out into this world and may have to work in pretty demanding and boring jobs that are intellectually unappealing. You will fall victim to the system of necessity that we've created for ourselves. And all that our society will be able to do is to give you leisure, to give you health insurance, to give you pension insurance, yeah, to make life possible after you have done your job somewhere. But this requires, after all, this common effort to rise above this necessity and to contain it, to constrain it, not to make it too overwhelming for our lives. Yeah? So this is the task that I perceive for Constitutionalism 2.0, and this is the task that is written out, sketched out in the form of rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is still our project. And it is a project that is fully continuous with the French Revolution. And as I'm not tired of saying this, and there are particular moments where I'm particularly right when I say it, and other moments where it's not so obvious, the French Revolution is not over. We are still right in the middle of the French Revolution because it's not finished. We haven't created the world that we have to create if we take all of these ideas seriously. All right. Yes, so the necessities are social constructions. The EMS and the necessity that it replies to is something that we construct as something by saying there is no alternative to it. But we are in a situation where we really do not see how we can control it. And I've explored towards the end of the book several alternatives that may come to mind, and I concluded, maybe unfortunately and unconvincingly, that with what we have on the horizon, the nation state may well be an important agent in the future. But I don't want to say that the book is actually about endorsing the nation state. It was just an attempt to arrive at some conclusion for the time being. It's not the last word that can be said about it. Okay. Maybe I should turn to Andrea. I'm sure that I've left many things out. Yeah, that Marcus said, but you can play it back to me. I already apologized that I didn't look into the political genesis of Italy. Yes, political parties do not play a role. Yes, but you know what? If I look at constitutionalism as a project, constitutionalism has always struggled. The forms of constitutionalism that I struggled have always struggled to include political parties. First of all, political constitutionalism 1.0. Constitutionalism 1.0, not political constitutionalism. Constitutionalism 1.0 actually was based on the fear of faction. If you look into the Federalist Papers, faction is something that had to be suppressed, and reason had to rule over passion, so very old-fashioned ideas actually that you encounter here. Political parties is something that came later, and Sylvester is completely right. They are important. They're an important factor for the separation of powers in our modern societies, but constitutionalism has not really much done to account for it. Neither has what I call constitutionalism 2.0. Yes, there is, of course, jurisprudence on the part of the Federal Constitutional Court that endorses the importance of political parties in societies and that they are necessary for a well-working political process. But if we look at the core normative commitments of constitutionalisms, in the case of constitutionalism 2.0, they're all embedded in the value order. It's the value order. Yeah? So yes, there is a gap, and I'm maybe guilty of not addressing this gap, but it's a gap that is part of our constitutionalism. Now, the normals of the earth. Why not more Carl Schmitt? I already thought that I would invite the charge that this is a Schmittian work, because at a certain point, Schmitt plays an important role by making a transition from 1.0 to 2.0, and the inconsistency that emerges in constitutionalism with regard to majority rule on the one hand, and the incorporation of non-negotiable principles like fundamental rights. Yeah, and Schmitt has correctly asked the question, why would we permit a supermajority to abolish all fundamental rights if fundamental rights are non-negotiable principles of practical reasons, if we understand them like that? So Schmitt is already there, very important, this part of the book. Why not more of it? Well, the explanation is, what I remember from the Normals of the Earth is the figure of the catechon, the state as the one that is halting the arrival of the apocalypse, or the apocalypse. And I never understood what this meant. There's so many Christians idea that I never fully understood as an ancient political philosopher, I say in my defense. Yeah? So there are things that I found absurd. And this is one of these absurd ideas that I get in the Normals of the Earth. And geopolitics, you're right. Yeah, why not more geopolitics in this book? It would have complicated matters a great deal more. Yeah? And this is why I included. Yes, the boundedness of political community is something that I emphasize. Schmidt emphasizes it by constructing this contrast between continental Europe and England, right? That's always the land that is committed to the sea and the countries that are committed to the soil. Yeah? People stand on the soil. This is too dark and too far to the right. My approach is simpler, and maybe it is oversimplified, but the approach is really simpler. We need boundaries in democracies because we need constituencies where we can count votes. Yeah, it has to be manageable. We have to have boundaries, and therefore we have to have peoples, and therefore the problem arises that democracies will create externalities for other countries or other democracies across their borders, and Constitutionalism 3.0 is an attempt to account for these externalities and to draw the right normative conclusions. And this is why I have this discussion of what I call the Darwin dogma of bourgeois Europeanists, because the bourgeois Europeanists take it for granted that any democracy is undemocratic by virtue of having boundaries, and therefore we have to have rights against these democratic processes, or outsiders have to have rights against these democratic processes. But there are actually two ways of internalizing these externalities, and one way is by giving outsiders rights, and the other is what you call, or what you cited as, friendly and sympathetic international relations. And I got quotation from me. That's right, friendly and sympathetic international relations. And I got pounded at the University Institute, at the European University Institute for this, because this is so meager. Hans-Ulrich Petersmann and my dear friend Matthias Kunde said, at this point you should have embraced global constitutionalism, because this is what global constitutionalism is all about. But I don't see why global constitutionalism is the necessary consequence of it. States can build, by using public international law, these structures of cooperation, and these structures of cooperation actually have to have as their point that states take mutually their interests into account. And if the European supranational institutions can be reconstructed by using this idea, this is a sound approach to it. I have no problems with it. But the topic of my book, I say in defense, is the new type of national constitution that emerges in the context of these developments, and therefore I didn't pay more attention to it than others do in their work. Virtual representation of foreigners, the remark with which I began. This was an attempt to understand a question that is posed as a result of the bounded nature of democracies, namely how the interests of foreigners, or those who live across a border, or those who are not represented in a political process, are represented even though they do not participate. Yeah, that's the question of virtual representation. How are the interests of someone represented even though that person or group does not participate in the polity? Burke's answer was that even though your borough does not elect a representative to parliament, there are other representatives that represent your social group, and as long as your social group, your description is represented, you are represented. That's a very meager and, I think, indefensible idea of virtual representation. But the idea becomes more defensible if you give it this slightly paradoxical twist and ask yourself, how are you as a foreigner, as a non-voter represented in a polity? And your absence, how is your absence accounted for in a political process in which you do not participate? Well, as long as it is possible to represent your interests in a polity, as long as it is merely possible, or as long as there is a group that actually represents your interests, but it is represented in a foreign country, and therefore you may be in a much worse position than you are at home. But this is the idea that I try to develop, and I don't know whether I find it myself fully persuasive. Yeah? How you are virtually represented in a different polity, and how the existence of democratic polities that protect fundamental rights and protect foreigners against discrimination discrimination on the ground of nationality, as long as this protection is in place, you can say that they are virtually represented. There's some virtual representation of foreigners. This is the idea. And this is how cosmopolitanism works for those who live as foreigners in a foreign polity. What the long-term consequence, you raise an important point with regard to social policy, of course, yeah? Whether it is desirable that we leave matters at that, that we just have protection against discrimination on the ground of nationality and international guarantees of the democratic process. This is what the Cosmopolitan Constitution promises. Whether this is sufficient to realize the aims of participation that are integral to Constitutionalism 2.0, or whether it will not lead to cutting on social spending so that foreigners may not benefit from them as well. So that it has this perverse indirect neoliberal effect, actually. This downsizing effect on the social programs of a social policy is an important question that you raise. And whether supranational regulation wouldn't be more desirable, I may well agree with you, given in particular that the European Union has this relatively perverse reverse composition, namely that all the social legislation is left to the member states and there's no social, or very little social legislation. Well, the most important part of social insurance schemes are not established on the European level. And the European Union would work better from a perspective of a social welfare state if there was everything on the European level that we need in terms of social insurance or social protection. I fully agree with you. Oh, let me again overstate the point. Yes, the European Union should be like Sweden, but it's difficult to imagine how we get there. That's the problem. Yeah. So this is okay. About my conclusion. My conclusion with the mixed constitution. My ancient sensibilities are revealed here. And you know what? I think it is salutary if we think about our social situation, begin to rethink and reconceive our social situation in an ancient manner, because this is something that was understood by the ancients. Societies or constitutional systems are not based in one people. There are class divisions in these societies. This was the first, I think this is the premise with which Aristotle's politics begins. There's always a class division in society, isn't it? A class is a modern concept, that's right. It's a modern concept, there are states, yeah? There are states, that's right. But how do you identify states in Aristotelian manner? Well, you first look at those who have the money and those who have no money, yeah? Well, it's not about the access of the means to production, not class in a Marxian sense, but the rich and the poor. And the rich can either be virtuous, and if they're virtuous, we call them aristocracy. If they're not virtuous, we call them oligarchs, yeah? And then there are the poor, and the poor are, by definition, driven by necessity and don't have the ability to be good. They cannot be good, they cannot be virtuous because they are so obsessed with their survival, yeah? So we have to create a situation where, at the end of the day, reason rules over, let's say, passion. Yeah, let me put it this way. And this is why we have a mixed constitution. And you know what's wonderful about it is that we throw away the idea of the people, and the idea of the people becomes increasingly cynical. If the very wealthy class is included into the people, as well as those who find themselves in desperate situations, left alone, left out of the societies, and therefore become the clients of right-wing party, the ochlos of ancient political thinking. We perceive our challenges better. This is something that I could address to my friends that pursue global constitutionalism, we perceive a situation post-sovereignty better because we no longer have to believe in the idea of popular sovereignty. Everything can be addressed, I think, from a sociological perspective more clearly if we begin to rethink our political situation in this term. Now, you may think that this is gloomy. I don't think it is so gloomy. It is gloomy only if you share the premises of modern constitutionalism, that there's sovereign power and everything originates from sovereign power. You interfere, jump in here, yeah?
Because this is a point that Andrea raised, but I share
Yeah.
fully. Of course, you're throwing away you're going into post-sovereignty and
Yeah.
going back to this conception of the mixed constitution, but you're also throwing away emancipation, social mobility, because you are entrenching social divisions.
Okay, yeah, this is a point that he made as well, and I'm you know, my perspective is a merely descriptive one. So I don't want to transform this into a norm in a sense, and this is the way it ought to be. What I say is that if we continue by using the vocabulary of modern constitutionalism with its normative orientation, we may well speak the language that is spoken by courts that adjudicate constitutional questions, may well speak the language of administrators that work from within the system. But if we want to understand our political situation well, I think we are better advised to use this ancient vocabulary. And no, the idea is not that you are locked forever into your social station. It wasn't like this in, let's say, the United Kingdom in the 17th century. Yeah? There was social mobility, limited, of course, limited social mobility, but you could rise to the level of the gentleman, and once you've risen to the level of the gentleman, sorry, this was a man's world, yeah? You then became eligible for a peerage in the House of Lords, so that there was this mobility upwards. There was no downwards mobility, of course, yeah, but there was this mobility upwards, yeah? I don't know, it's an invitation to conceive, to look at conflict and struggle and managing this conflict between different, let me call them, segments of society, as a fundamental challenge for our political systems. And we may identify populists today of several persuasions to the left and to the right. And we may say this is a new phenomenon that's unprecedented. But forgive me, in my opinion, we talk about democracy in the ancient sense if we look at it. Yeah? Our modern concept of democracy is always a hybrid product of aristocracy and democracy. We actually have homogenized the mixed constitution that mixes aristocracy and democracy into the concept of modern democracy by assimilating it to the sovereign people, yeah, and looking at it through the lens of sovereignty and the sovereign people. But this synthesis is a synthesis that is constantly falling apart when we engage in political arguments. We always take the sides of those who know better, who have more virtue than the others, who adopt a more long-term perspective. We talk like aristocrats to the populists. Yeah? So this division is something that re-emerges in our political discourses all the time, which is why I try to remind us of it and why it is still with us. I do not say that we return to our ancient political language because there's something that we've forgotten and we have to recover it. It's in our heads all the time. It's there. It's a way of thinking that is part of our culture that hasn't disappeared. All right. Giulio, you've raised very important points. First of all, thank you for reintroducing the importance of social freedom, and I've said something about it already, a little bit, what I imagine by it. The large-scale realization of social freedom would be, in my opinion, epitomized in a theory of social justice that actually builds on the idea, and I'm pretty much an unreconstructed Rawlsian when it comes to this, yeah? So Aristotelian and Rawlsian in one person. It's very strange, yeah? I know. But the society is a system of cooperation for the benefit of all, and each has to make a certain contribution to it, and making such a contribution is legitimate to ask for you if you get benefits in return. On a micro level, you may end up in relationships of alienation. So the job that you work may be completely dull. But if the overall life that you live is better than a life that is lived under more egalitarian conditions, you may arguably still be better off. And the whole structure of interaction, therefore, realizes something like social freedoms, because it's based on the idea that our overall situation in life should be as good as possible for all, and what we do is we cooperate in order to make it mutually possible for all. So a society that is mediated by a defensible conception of justice would be this type of society. And how do we, in a legal context, try to imagine such a society? We look at the full package of human rights. We look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is, it's so sad, but true. In the 1970s, 1980s, the left always dismissed these ideas as completely bourgeois and selling the idea of human emancipation short. But we've lost alternative visions. This is the vision that we've left, at the end of history, in a sense. Yeah, that's all there is. The question that you raised, Julia, is a good one. How does all that I lump together in the category of Constitutionalism 3.0 fit together? Human rights, international human rights protection on the one hand, and emergency action with the understanding that someone has to do something, because otherwise everything is collapsing and going down the drain. Someone has to act, and those institutions put themselves forward that have the capacity to address the issues. And legal constraints, well, we rationalize it afterwards. Yeah? So how does this fit together? The only link that I perceive is, well, no, there are two links that I perceive. First of all, what Hegel would have called the external state, the Notenverstandesstaat, the state that actually addresses public beds, the state that addresses the adverse consequences of decentralized cooperation on markets, the unintended bad effects. This type of state has increasingly moved to a transnational scale, where states either cooperate, where we have agencies, informal institutions that cooperate and set standards that everyone then complies with. Yeah. So you have this international dimension. The part of the Constitution that actually constitutes agency in order to address certain issues has moved upwards, in a sense, to the international level. So this is part of it, the international component. And I guess the more apolitical we as citizens become, the more we tend to be willing to buy into an arrangement where a credible case can be made that the International Monetary Fund knows what it's doing, that the European Commission knows what it's doing, that the EMS is composed of experts that know how to handle a currency crisis, yeah? And we are willing to buy into regulation by all this expertise as long as our human rights are protected. So we are creating on the international level, in the context of 3.0, an arrangement where representative bodies fall by the wayside as something that has become increasingly cumbersome, superfluous, slow in reaction, less capable of addressing issues because they move slow and they have less expertise. Yeah? So we are approaching a situation where people may ask themselves, well, why do we have parliamentary representation? After all, as long as my human rights are adequately protected by a multi-level system of fundamental rights protection. That's the question that I have here. Yeah? And please, be sure, again, it's an ancient way of thinking about it. Constitutionalism 3.0 has a bright side, a successful way, and a dark side, a problematic, a deeply troubling way of realizing itself. And the rise of the administrative state on the international level is a deeply troubling part about it. And by the way, this is where the state is present in my book, yeah? In the form of the external state, yeah? All right. The book is Eurocentric, and actually straightforwardly and unashamedly Eurocentric, because it's an attempt to account for our European experience. Is it equally applicable to Germany and Greece? Well, I think I take the position of those who find themselves in receivership, yeah? Who have to follow the dictates of international institutions seriously. I don't play it down in the book. So I think it's applicable to Greece as well as Germany, that is more in the position of a doer. I haven't addressed the case explicitly in these national terms, and I haven't spent too much time on it. but I think it is applicable to it. What is missing, you're right, and this was your last critique, the agent of constitutional transformation. You all repeated Schelling's reply to Hegel, yeah, sure. And I'm also not entirely convinced that ending with the nation state is the solution to all problems. Yeah, you're right. This is maybe an unconvincing solution, and maybe the only solution to our problems is in Europe is to transform the European Union into Sweden. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. This would be it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So.
Thank you, Professor Alexander Zollner, who was able to cover in 45 minutes 6 pages.
Okay.
Over 6 pages of comments and questions. And if there are other questions you would like to raise, you need some clarification on certain points.
If you want to criticize my commentators, please feel free. Yeah. No, it's fine. It was really, it is very rewarding, you know, if you get this very sympathetic comment after all. Because, I mean, this is published, but it's never finished. Never finished.
There are no questions at least at the moment for the audience. I have my own
Okay.
I would like to frame it in a quite provocative way. My first remark, which is the following: does constitutionalism 2.0 really exist, or has constitutionalism 2.0 really existed? I raise this question because in the narrative we are quite instructed that constitutionalism 1.0 starts with the American Constitution, that constitutionalism 2.0 starts at the end of World War II, but we don't have the date of birth of constitutionalism 3.0. Somehow, this is implicit when at the start of the part dealing with constitutionalism 3.0, Alexander Zollner introduces the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yeah.
Now, chronologically speaking, it is 1950. It coincides with constitutionalism 3.0. So we could argue that constitutionalism 2.0 already from the start introduced the cosmopolitan constitution. This is I don't like the part of trying to use the Italian constitutional debate, but in the debate of the Italian Constituent Assembly, that emerged very well. Pietro Calamandrei, in illustrating the content of the Italian Constitution, emphasized the fact that it was a constitution that was not only inward looking, but was a constitution which was open from the start. Whereas the narrative is a narrative that portrays the evolution as the other period which was 1.0, then then perhaps these could provide a different sense in which the cosmopolitan constitution is not necessarily a constitution which implies the demise of constitutionalism. We could have a cosmopolitan constitution which is reinforcing the constitutionalism. If we rehabilitate in this way the international engagement of national constitutions, we could end up with more optimism. Normally it is good. We could, for instance, think that a different sort of constitutionalism 3.0 could be desirable. Could be desirable and should not necessarily imply the post-political constitutionalism which is portrayed in the last part of the book. I think that the last part of the book is very good in denouncing the current state of affairs. But I'm not convinced that this is the only type of cosmopolitan constitution we could have. We could have a cosmopolitan constitution which helps national democratic constitution to be true to themselves, to maintain their normative commitments. We could even have a cosmopolitan constitution that is capable to reframe the membership of citizens in a cosmopolitan way without arriving at a situation in which cosmopolitan citizens are part of a multitude rather than a few. This is the current state of affairs. I'm completely sympathetic with this analysis. I find it telling that, for instance, European citizenship has at the core not a political right, but the right to move. There are formidable pages in the book explaining why the right to move is not a functional equivalent to a political right. The right to voice your aspirations, your interest in the political sphere. It gives rise to a different type of membership, totally different. But we could have a sort of constitutionalism 3.0 that enhances political membership rather than encroach or mistreat political membership. Let's just consider for a moment, and then make some utopic these days. If the European Union citizenship would be coupled with the element of having political rights in the first state, the possibility to vote at general elections when you reside in another member state. At that point, we would end up having a totally different type of membership, but it would be a political cosmopolitanism attempt. In this regard, and this is a criticism to the book traces a too simplifying distinction between the members of the polity and the foreigners. Foreigners are treated as completely, it is a complete category including asylum seekers, economic migrants, European citizens. Perhaps the promise, I think, involved, the still existing promise of European integration would be one in which there are several categories of foreigners, part of whom, the European citizens, are politically empowered. Not really they have the possibility of being members of a pan-European constitutional democracy. I'm skeptical. I'm more skeptical than Alessandro Zola in this regard, because we have also to read this book alongside an article published in the European Law Journal, Europe Political and Not Cosmopolitan, in which he elaborates the argument that Europe should be like Sweden. He didn't say that, but that's the core of the argument. I'm more pessimistic in that regard, but I'm more optimistic in the possibility of empowering European citizens where they go abroad. Empowering them not only as market participants, as migrants, as workers, but empowering them as political subjects. I would city.
Yeah.
The internal metropolitan.
Internal cosmopolitan.
We need to clarify this.
Okay. Yeah, the internal cosmopolitan. First. All right. Okay. Let me just go back to the stages of development. Historically, what's interesting, historically, I would still maintain, even though the European Convention on Human Rights was signed and adopted in the 1950s, it was, as every textbook describes it, a sleeping beauty until the 1970s. So the effect has been only later. And I would actually say on a concept, if you push it back to the conceptual level, Constitutionalism 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 should be there simultaneously, but they aren't for historical reasons only. We should have Constitutionalism 2.0 from the outset, because the Bill of Rights, the rights contained in a Bill of Rights, were then understood to be as the rights that of necessity any member of a free society is entitled to have protected. Yeah? Why should it be left at the mercy of transient supermen? Yeah? So you could have raised the question already in the 1800s. Yeah? It's just exercised this transformative effect only after the Second World War. Likewise, Constitutionalism 3.0 could be able, I think, you could make a strong argument, made a little bit of an argument, actually. Yeah, okay, sorry. I've made a little bit of an argument by looking into the history of the privileges and immunity clause in the American Constitution, that we have these early epiphanies, as I called it, of 2.0 and 3.0, at the early stages of the American Republic. So this idea that the Constitution is embedded into an international system where states mutually support each other to sustain their republican governments, this is not alien, of course, to 1.0. It is just that the emphasis of constitutionalism has shifted historically later to this, but conceptually it is all there. I mean, the French Revolution is still going on. Yeah? It was already there and it's still going on. It just took us some time to draw out the implications fully. There is nevertheless something that happens in the course of this history, and this is that the people, the national people, increasingly recede into the background. Can you understand me better now? Yeah? Can you hear me? The people recede into the background. They become. They no longer take the center stage. Is it turned on now? Yeah? Okay, good. They no longer take the central stage of the constitutional project. And this is something that happens more or less historically. I find myself in a very awkward position if I appeal to the people. I begin to suspect that I've fallen victim to right-wing political sensibilities. Whoever says people today says völkisch, in a sense. Yeah, it's unavoidable. Yeah, it didn't used to be that way. It wasn't that way at all. This has changed. The people only, under the conditions of Constitutionalism 3.0, actually, the difference of peoples is only relevant in the difference of different systems of constitutional adjudication. Yeah? So the encounter that constitutions make with one another, when it comes to the protection of fundamental rights, is in the instances in the context of constitutional borrowing, where one country looks at what the other is doing on the level of constitutional adjudication, and of course in the European Convention system, where you ask the question whether they stay within the margin of appreciation or whether the European societies have moved into a certain direction. So peoples are actually sublated to the level, aufgehoben in a Hegelian sense, into their national constitutional systems. And that's an actual change that has taken place. Yeah, that's more than just the drawing out the conceptual consequences of 1.0. Yeah, okay. So that's it. You could say simultaneously all the ideas are given, but it takes time to draw out the consequences, and there's a real transformation with regard to the relevance of the people to a constitutional system. That's one thing. What else did you say? Yes, I'm not at all against short residence periods before we give foreigners voting rights. I'm not at all opposed to it. What I tried to explore in this book is a type of a constitution that actually speaks to those who do not vote because they are not citizens, to the foreigners, and says, this is a society that you can inhabit because there is a well-working democratic process. You can trust into this well-working democratic process. You no longer have to be a citizen of this society in order to find it legitimate and to find yourself in a very specific and very special way self-determinating as a foreigner, in that you yield to the self-determination of a foreign polity. I could explain it longer to the audience if you wanted to, how I conceive of self-determination and collective self-determination, that it always involves an act of yielding to someone who wants something. You're collectively self-determining nationally if you yield to your majority out of loyalty to your country, for example. So you value your membership to your society more highly than getting your political way in this society, therefore you yield to the majority, and you're still self-determining because what determines you is your membership to the polity. Yeah? So likewise, you are self-determining in a foreign country if you yield the determination that you make to other citizens because you identify with your position as a foreigner, and it's a reasonable way of being in this world, and not something that is to be by all means avoided because your fundamental rights are protected and you are protected against discrimination on ground of nationality. This is something that I try to explain in the book. But both of you made now a very important point. Foreigners are a mixed bag. So from a social class perspective in particular, I should be more careful about whom I include into this bag. This is something that is really missing, and I don't have a good answer for you now. Because what I did, of course, in my book was to extrapolate from my perfectly comfortable position as a foreigner in the United States. I was a luxury foreigner, a pampered foreigner in the United States, with all the privileges that go along with it. But it's different, of course, if you are a migrant worker working on a field, in Iowa in particular. Then your experience is a different one. That's something that I need to address in the future. You're right about it. Yeah. I stop here.
Other questions, curiosities? Would you like from the panel to reply to the comments?
I would like to say directly, but if you give me the occasion, maybe I have an answer because why you didn't make such a distinction, because you're forcing your interpretation of your will, because your main aim was to criticize the role elites are assuming themselves. You are criticizing how scholar elites had in the last 20 years supported this neoliberalist project. And you want to explain that our elite, role as elite can be also something dignified, something politically worth, even if we accept this role as foreigner.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Now, I also I'm sorry. Now I've turned it off. Now it's turned on. Yeah. Okay. Yes, the book is written against the hijacking of constitutionalism by neoliberalism. Yeah, so that's in a sense true. Yeah, that's a short way of putting it. I also try to explore a certain danger that I perceive. The danger of leading a comfortable, apolitical life, where the center of life shifts to your private ambition. And that's something that's present in constitutionalism all the time. Yeah, if you look back and read Thomas Paine, what is the point? It goes down. That's right, yeah. Modern liberty, it's about your private pursuits, your private career. This is at the center of your attention. But once you live under conditions under which everyone trusts the authorities that have been created in order to address problems of a scale where you do not have political institutions to monitor them, simply because they do not exist yet, yeah, or they are too detached from you, you may easily feel comfortable in this world and make your peace with this world and say, well, as long as my fundamental rights are protected, I live as a foreigner in a completely foreign world, in a sense. I no longer participate politically. So it's this danger of a completely apolitical world, yeah, and an apolitical form of constitutionalism that I address. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for following all the seminar. I would like to thank first of all you for the participation, and then the commentators, and of course the author of the book.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And we hope there will be other occasions for this. And again, the book is worthy, and I strongly suggest you to have a look. It could be useful for your research, especially if you are pursuing a PhD. Either not necessarily if you are interested in constitutional, but it could be a very useful background reading also in other fields of the law. See you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.